Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you with us. Prisoners across these United States began a 3-week-long strike to protest modern-day enslavement of people in U.S. prisons. The first day of the strike marked the anniversary of the murder of George Jackson in 1971 in San Quentin Prison in California. George Jackson, of course, was a prisoner who led a radical movement inside the walls of those prisons. The strike is scheduled to end on September the 9th, which marks the anniversary of the Attica rebellions, where prisoners seized the Attica Correctional Facility in New York in 1971. Previous strikes have ended with leaders of those strikes being put in solitary confinement, and many times when strikers were met with a violent response by prison officials. The prisoners, led by the Jailhouse Lawyers Speak and supported by the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, are demanding an end to the death penalty and dying in prison, an end to labor without pay, an end to solitary confinement, reinstitution of Pell Grants, education programs, and instituting plans for rehabilitation and the right to vote, and more. And we'll be following all of this up and following the strike and hoping that prisoners' efforts will not lead to their persecution nor their prosecution. We are joined today by the pastor Kenneth Glasgow. He's the founder and president of Ordinary People Society. He's convener of the National Criminal Justice Coalition and co-chairman of the formerly incarcerated and convicted People's Movement. And Pastor, welcome. Good to have you with us back on The Real News.
Welcome, and thank you for having me.
So the first major strike that took place in this country among people inside incarcerated was in 2016, September of 2016. So tell me, from that movement to this point on, almost 2 years later, what the difference is and what's happening at this moment.
Well, basically, there is not too much of a difference because of the fact that none of the demands were ever met. The Free Alabama movement called to action. 20 different states joined in, 40 to 50 prisons across this country, men and women that's incarcerated. We, as the formerly incarcerated convicted People's Movement, supported them, stood in solidarity with 40 to 50 different organizations across this country, and we have yet to see some of the results of them locking up children, of them with the Habitual Offender Act, of what's going on with our rights to votes all across the country, and different things that are going on. So that's why what we have declared now and what has been declared by the Free Alabama movement inside the Alabama prisons is the fact that they're asking that we redistribute the pain. And in redistributing the pain, they're doing peaceful strikes all across the country again to say, hey, you need to stop brutalizing those that are incarcerated, treat us more humanely, and you give us our rights. And so they're asking us and putting more pressure on those of us who are on the outside, who are directly impacted just as they are formerly incarcerated, currently incarcerated, to come together and say, hey, we are clearly the ones that fit the category of no taxation, taxation without representation. Okay? So why are we being taxed and we don't have our rights to vote? Because when we don't have our right to vote, we are considered non-citizens or second-class citizens. So they're asking us to redistribute the pain and tell them no election, no re-election, as long as you taxing us. And so these are the things that's going on. We're looking at innocence inquiry commissions that's supposed to be in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, and these prisons in South Carolina that is looking at death sentences, but not looking at any other sentences to see if those people are innocent. We're looking at juveniles being targeted even younger now than they were in 2016. In 2016, we were looking at our 17 and 18-year-olds and some of our 16-year-olds. Now, it has become predominant all across this country that once you're 16, you're classified as an adult. And they're dropping down to our 14 and 15-year-olds. We're looking at these habitual acts and these habitual sentences that are coming across the nation. And we're looking at the police brutality that is happening on the inside as well as on the outside. So we have came in a collective voice that we will not be erased and our voices will be heard. And so this is what they're doing on the inside for the first wave. And of course, you know, just like the first national strike, the second wave is for those of us outside. And we started with the Free to Vote. I launched the Free to Vote campaign, free number 2 to vote campaign across the country where they go inside the jails and register people to vote who have not been convicted yet and who have not been sentenced. And those on the inside across the country who are not like Alabama, where they could vote, inside prisons and jails because of my lawsuit in 2008, they're doing, and as you see the picture of Kinetic Justice, they're doing what's called the Vote For Me campaign. The Vote For Me campaign. It's going to be very, very significant in Florida because we have Amendment 4 on the ballot in Florida. But in other places, it's going to affect their elections in 2018 because each and every person that is inside prison that's a prisoner has at least 10 to 20 people that's a friend, a family member, or a supporter that will be influenced to vote for that person that is locked up inside that has lost their votes. One of the significant things that people need to understand is that inside prison, they have time to even do the candidate opponent research. So we're there directing us and we're out here directing them on who's best, that's fighting for our rights, that's fighting for our humanity, and that's looking at criminal justice and reform and prison reform and all that.
So from what I've been reading, that I know the right to vote is a part of the 10 demands that people are making across the country. There are a lot of demands inside this movement, and from my understanding, in some ways this was triggered by the killing of a number of inmates in South Carolina at one prison that they tried to call a gang movement, but in reality was a great deal deeper than that. And that this is being spread across the country at the moment. There are people who are incarcerated in Nova Scotia, California, New York, other places around the country, and they think 4 or 5 other states, though they can't get the information out at the moment about where it's really happening, that this is spreading across country.
Well, it's also in Alabama, Florida, especially Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and all the southern states. And you should see quoted Melvin Ray as well as Kinetic Justice as well.
So the question is, this movement is supposed to last until September on the anniversary of Attica. And I wonder how you see building a movement from the inside and the outside that ends the kind of modern slavery that takes place inside of a prison.
Well, our ultimate goal, another thing you must look at is when it ends on September 9th, we'll be having a national conference, the formerly incarcerated convicted people's movement. We'll go into our national conference in Orlando, Florida, the September 13th through the 15th. And you can go to ficpfm.org, ficpfm.org to learn more about that. And in our national conference, our ultimate goal for all of us collectively, currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, is to address the 13th Amendment. We need to ultimately get the exception clause out of the 13th Amendment that still has slavery written in our Constitution.
Yes, Pastor, for our viewers, I'm gonna read the 13th Amendment, and then before we have to leave each other for this first segment we do together on this prison strike that we really want to cover here at The Real News, let me read this 13th Amendment, and then let's talk a bit about what this means. I mean, many people don't realize what it really says. So let me just do that. Here we go. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall then be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So this is really kind of a very important point, I think, here, that we have that people who are incarcerated historically have been shopped out to people for free labor all throughout the South and the North and the West, everywhere. Now, this is at the heart of this, that this is really enslavement by another name.
Yes. And so what we have is still written in our Constitution as an exception clause, slavery. You know, convict leasing and all this, a lot of these counties and different parts of the southern states and all, where you would use convict leasing. That's how a lot of black folks got in a lot of different areas. But now we still have it in our Constitution. But also, if we want to get real technical and go into it, we'll do it at a different time. But there's also a contradiction to our Constitution, because it says no one can be held under involuntary servitude or slavery except as a means of punishment. But then it says in the 8th Amendment, according to Brother Abdullah, it says in the 8th Amendment, there should be no cruel and unusual punishment. What is more cruel and unusual than slavery and indentured servitude? Mm.
And it's also shown, I mean, this is actually our historical roots of this have to do with the end of Reconstruction in 1877, and then that swelling of a mass incarceration of black people throughout the South that actually used this amendment to renew slavery in the South. And now it's moved across to the prison system all over America.
Yes, and the reason they connected it and we put it so much with voting rights is because of the fact that when Dr. King got voting rights in 1965, then Nixon came out in 1971, 6 years later, with the drug war to get more black people locked up with slavery, because we can look at the disparities and see that white people use drugs 15 to 20 times more than black folks, but black folks go to jail and prison 15 to 20 times more than white folks who use more drugs. And so what it was set up to disenfranchise and take away those voting rights. One of the biggest things that Darcy Nunn, one of my colleagues, say all the time is that he would hate to leave California where he gained his rights and become a non-citizen when he comes to Georgia. And that's the kind of stuff that we have to do. You know, people want to try to make this a blanket situation and look at it, oh, these are prisoners, oh, they committed. Well, let's look at it like this. We are human beings. We are people with convictions. I'm not your ex-convict. I'm not your ex-felon. I'm not your ex-offender. That's just like calling me the N-word. You know, and people say, well, oh, Glasgow, how is that relative to racism? Well, it may not be racism, but it's classism. The same hurt, the same pain, the same effects. And this is what we're feeling inside prison as well as outside prison. And that's why they're having the peaceful strikes right now.
Well, Pastor Kenneth Glasgow, I really appreciate the time you took with us today, and we are looking forward to covering the strike over the next 2 weeks that takes place in prisons around this country. It is moving across America and into Canada. And thank you so much for your work, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. And look at it. Don't forget, September 9th, when it all ends, you got to look at, we're going straight into our conference. We need to all come together, all allies, all families, all friends. Everyone is affected by prison nowadays. Everyone. Either you work for a prison or you work for a company that is getting stuff out of people that work for prisons. One of the biggest fallacies to me and the hypocrisies is the fact that we would work in prisons. They would use us for convict leasing to work in their industries, to work in their companies, to make uniforms, to make furniture, to make lockers, to make even Victoria's Secret and all these different things that women wear. And then when we get out, they won't give us a job. But we can work for them for 25 cents an hour in prison. God bless you.
And we're going to continue to cover this strike here on The Real News through September 9th to let you know what's happening in the movements inside of our prisons. And I'm Mark Steiner for The Real News Network. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.